They dragged her through the freezing mud. A woman, heavy with child, sentenced to die in a forest where nothing human survives. Her own pack called her low, a burden, a thing to be thrown away. And so they threw her, over the edge of the world, into the fog and the rot and the things that hunt in the dark. The cold came first, then the growls, then the slow circle of starving eyes, closing in around the one place she shielded with both trembling arms. She had no weapon, no pack, no hope. But what none of them knew, what not one of them could have guessed, was who had fathered the life inside her, and what was beginning, even now, to wake in her blood. The silence held its breath. Something ancient was about to open its eyes. The mud was cold enough to bite. It seeped through the thin cloth at her knees, climbing into her bones, and still she did not move. She knelt at the center of the courtyard, a ring of faces around her. Every one of them turned hard. The morning smelled of wood smoke and wet fur and something sharper underneath. The iron tang of a crowd that had already decided how the day would end. Her name was Marin, 5 months along, her belly round beneath a tunic too worn to keep out the wind. Her hands rested there now, not folded in prayer, folded in protection. The pack jeered. Voices rose and fell like weather. She did not flinch. That was the thing they could not understand, the thing that made them louder. They wanted her to break. They wanted tears, begging, the small, ugly music of a creature giving up. And Marin gave them silence instead, not because she had no words, because she had chosen them, swallowed them, locked them somewhere deep where no fist could reach. Her silence was not weakness. It was the last thing she owned. Holt moved through the crowd like heat through dry grass. He was the kind of leader who ruled by the size of his shadow, and his shadow fell over her now, blotting out the pale light. "Look at her," he said. His boot found the mud near her knee and drove down, sending a cold splash against her skin. The crowd loved it. They always loved it. "An Omega," Holt went on, his voice carrying, "the lowest of us. And now she kneels here, swollen with something she will not name." He crouched, close enough that she could smell the ale on him, the old leather, the sour edge of a man who mistook cruelty for strength. "Tell us," he said softly, almost gentle, which was worse. "Whose is it?" Marin kept her eyes on the ground. She thought of the answer. She held it in her mouth like a coal. If she spoke it, if she gave them the name, they would not banish her. They would tear her apart where she knelt, and the child with her. So she said nothing, and the silence stretched, and the crowd leaned in, hungry for the thing she would not give. Her thoughts drifted, because they had to, because the present was a blade, and the past was the only soft place left. It had been warmer then. The memory came in pieces, the way the best ones do, a festival in a stretch of neutral ground where no pack held sway, where the rules went loose for one night under a low gold moon, lanterns in the trees, music that did not belong to anyone, the rare and dizzying freedom of being no one, of being unwatched. She had slipped away from the others just to breathe, and in an orchard heavy with the scent of ripe fruit and crushed grass, she had collided with a stranger, a man in a plain dark mask. The pull had been instant. That was the part she could never explain, not even to herself. It was not a decision. It was gravity. Something in her chest had turned toward him the way a flower turns, without asking permission. He had smelled of cedar and cold rain, and something beneath it that made her knees forget their job. His hand had found the small of her back, and the touch had gone through her like warmth through ice. Slow, sure, as though he had been waiting a long time for a thing he could not name. They had not spoken much. There had not seemed to be a need. And later, in the dark beneath an old willow, when the mask slipped, she had seen his eyes. One the blue of deep winter, one the gold of a banked fire. She had known then, in a lurch of terror that no pleasure could drown, exactly who held her. Not a wanderer, not a stranger passing through. A king, the most powerful wolf for 1,000 miles, the one whose name mothers used to frighten children into sleep. And she, a servant who scrubbed other people's floors and mended other people's wounds, a nobody with a healer's hands and a borrowed name. So she had run, before the sky paled, before he woke. She had pulled herself from the warmth of him and fled into the trees, certain she could outrun what they had made. Certain she could fold herself back into her small gray life and disappear. She had been wrong, because what they had made was growing inside her now. And a secret like that does not stay buried. A secret like that, if the wrong mouths ever spoke it, could set fire to everything. 2 kingdoms, a bloodline, a war that would not end in her lifetime. She pressed her hand harder against her belly. Stay quiet, she told it silently. Stay safe. Just a little longer. Far from that courtyard, across miles of pine and snow, a man came awake before dawn with his heart already running. Cade did not know why. He only knew the feeling, the way one knows a sound heard in another room, that something was wrong, and that the wrongness was his. He sat up in the dark. For months it had lived in him, this ache with no wound to explain it. A pull behind the breastbone, a tightness that loosened for nothing. He had stood at his window more nights than he would admit, breathing the cold air, certain that somewhere out there a thread had been tied to him and then yanked taut. There had been a night. He remembered it the way the body remembers heat. A mask. An orchard. A woman who had fit against him as though the world had carved her to that shape, and then vanished before the sun, leaving nothing but a scent he had been chasing in his sleep ever since. Cedar could not cover it. Distance could not dull it. It was hers, and lately the pull had changed, sharpened, carried something new threaded through it, something faint and impossibly precious, a second pulse beneath the first that made the hair rise along his arms whenever he let himself feel it. He did not have a word for what it meant, but the wolf in him did. "Find her," he said to the dark. It was not a wish. It was an order given to himself in a voice that did not shake. Back in the courtyard, the cold had crept all the way to her teeth. Holt straightened. He was done with gentleness. The crowd sensed the shift the way animals sense thunder, and a low buzz of anticipation moved through them. "She will not speak," he announced. "She protects something filthy, something that has no place in this pack." A woman near the front called out a word that Marin had heard too many times to feel any more. A boy laughed. And somewhere in that ring of faces, a smaller figure did not laugh at all. A young Omega named Nessa, half hidden behind the broad shoulders of the others, her eyes wet and her jaw clenched, watching Marin the way you watch someone you cannot save. Marin felt that gaze. It was the only warm thing in the courtyard. She lifted her head, then, slowly, just enough. Not in defiance, not yet. Just enough to let them see that she was still there, behind the mud and the silence and the swelling under her hands. Still a person, still choosing. Her eyes were the soft brown of riverbed stone, and they did not beg. Holt saw it, and it angered him, because a creature that will not break is a creature you cannot fully own. "Take her," he said. The crowd shivered with pleasure, and Marin, kneeling in the cold that had become a part of her, did the only thing left that no one could take. She kept her secret. She kept her child. And deep beneath her ribs, in a place older than fear, something she did not yet understand turned over once, like a sleeper beginning, at last, to wake. Holt let the silence build before he spoke. He understood crowds. He understood the way dread tastes better when it is poured slowly. And so he stood there above her, in no hurry at all, while the wind combed through the courtyard and tugged at the torn hem of her tunic. "There is a place," he said at last, "where we send what cannot be cleaned." A ripple moved through the pack. They knew. Of course they knew. The Hollow. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the rings of it spread out across every face. Marin felt it more than heard it. Felt it in the way the crowd drew breath all at once. Felt it in the way even the cruelest mouths went briefly slack, because there were things that frightened them too. And the Hollow was the oldest of them. It was a stretch of forest where the trees grew wrong, where the light went gray at noon and the air smelled of rot and old water and blood that had soaked too long into the ground. The wolves who lived there were not wolves anymore, not truly. They were the cast out, the mind broken, the ones who had gone savage in the dark for so long that they had forgotten what it was to be anything but hunger. No one walked into the Hollow and walked back out. To be sent there was not banishment. It was a death, dressed up in softer clothes. "You cannot," Marin said. Her voice came out rough from a morning of disuse, but it did not waver. 2 words, the first she had given them all day, and they cut through the crowd like a blade through smoke. Holt turned. He had not expected her to speak. None of them had. And for the length of a heartbeat, something flickered behind his eyes that might have been surprise, might even have been a grudging and ugly respect, before he buried it under that familiar sneer. "She speaks," he said, at last. Marin pressed both hands flat against her belly and made herself rise. It was not graceful. Her legs shook under her. The cold had stiffened every joint, and the weight of the child pulled her balance forward, and twice she nearly sank back down into the mud. But she stood. She forced herself to stand, because a thing said from the knees is a beggar's thing. And she was finished begging for herself. She would beg for one reason only, and it was not her own life. "Send me to the edge of the world if you must," she said. Her breath fogged the narrow space between them. "Cast me out among the far towns. Let me vanish into the snow. Whatever you decide for me, I will take it, and I will never speak the name of this pack again." She drew a breath that hurt. "But not the Hollow. Not for the child. The child has done nothing to any of you." For one long moment, the courtyard held its breath along with her. And then Holt laughed. It was a low sound, almost warm, and it was the cruelest thing she had heard all day. "The child," he said softly, "is the crime." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his body, the sour weight of his certainty, the smell of leather and ale, and a man who had never once in his life doubted that he deserved to win. He bent his head so that the last words were for her alone. "You should have spoken sooner, healer." His voice was almost gentle now, and that was the worst of it. "You mended their fevers through the long winters. You pulled their pups into the world with these very hands. You sat up through the nights they were too frightened to sit through alone. And not one of them, not a single one, will lift a finger for you now. That is what you are to them, useful. And then used up." He let it settle into her like cold water into cloth. Then he straightened and he lifted his arm, and his voice rose again for the crowd. "Take her to the ridge." The pack exhaled into noise, relief and excitement, and something darker underneath. That giddy, ugly release of people who have been given permission to be terrible together. They spat at the ground near her feet. They threw the old words, the ones meant to grind a person down to nothing. The ones she had heard so many times they had nearly stopped having edges. Nearly. Maren did not bend under them. She lifted her chin and looked through them, past them. The way you look at weather you cannot stop and refuse to let frighten you. And that was when she felt it. A small hand, quick, trembling, pressing something cold and hard into her open palm beneath the cover of her sleeve. Maren did not turn her head. She had survived too long by knowing exactly when not to turn her head. But her fingers closed around the gift, and she knew the shape of it at once. A knife, small, worn smooth at the handle from years of use. The kind a kitchen omega might carry to cut bread and trim candle wicks, and nothing braver than that. The girl who had pressed it there was already easing back into the crowd. Nessa. Maren caught only the edge of her face, the wet eyes, the mouth held tight and white to keep from giving them both away. A girl barely grown, who owned nothing in this world, who had everything to lose and no power to spare, and who had reached across a gulf of pure terror to put one small steel kindness into a dying woman's hand. Their eyes met for less than a breath. "Thank you," Maren told her, with no voice at all, only her gaze. "Now go, before they see." And then Nessa was gone, folded back into the safety of the crowd, and the moment closed over like water over a stone. But Maren held the knife, and the knife held more than steel. It held proof. Proof that even here, even in the middle of all this, she had not been entirely abandoned. One person had seen her. One person had looked at the woman in the mud and decided she was still worth a risk. It was almost enough to break her where all their cruelty had failed. She closed her fist tight around it and let none of it show on her face. The climb to the ridge was long. Garrick took her by the upper arm and pulled her from the courtyard, and the pack did not follow far. They had taken their satisfaction. The rest was only a chore, and the cold was rising, and the fires were warm behind them. So they drifted back to their ale and the comfort of having watched someone else fall instead of themselves. So it was only the two of them, in the end, on the steep path up through the twisted pines. Garrick did not speak. He was a big man, scarred along one side of his jaw, with a grip that left bruises he did not seem to notice he was leaving. He was the hand the pack used when it did not want to dirty its own. Everyone knew the stories. He had thrown others over this same edge and come back down with dry eyes. But there was something in the set of his shoulders today. Marin noticed it the way a healer notices everything, the small tells the body cannot hide, the way his jaw kept working on words he did not say, the way his eyes fixed hard on the trail ahead and refused again and again to drop to the swell of her belly, the way his grip, for all its brutal strength, never quite closed to the point of true pain. A man certain of what he is doing does not avoid looking at it. She filed that away without quite knowing why. She did not understand yet what it meant. But she had learned long ago that the world was rarely as simple as the loudest people in it, and that even a hard hand could be attached to a divided heart. They climbed. The trees thinned and grew stranger. The air went sharp and high and cold enough to ache in the teeth. And as her body labored up over the wet rocks, her mind, worn down past its defenses, slipped its leash and went somewhere warmer. It went back to him, to the orchard and the low gold moon, and the heat of a hand resting at the small of her back. She had been afraid that night too, but it had been a different kind of fear entirely. The good kind, the kind that lives in the same room as wonder. His thumb had traced one slow circle against the curve of her spine, unhurried, certain, and the whole loud world had narrowed down to that single point of warmth. His breath had been close at her ear. He had smelled of cedar and cold rain, and some deep, clean thing beneath it that she had wanted to wrap herself inside and never come out of. He had not rushed her. That was the thing she kept returning to, even now, even here on this freezing trail. He had touched her as though there were nowhere else in all the world he needed to be. As though she were not a servant with cracked hands and a borrowed name. As though she were something rare and long awaited. Something worth slowing down for. No one had ever touched her as though she were worth slowing down for. And when his hand had risen to her cheek, when the rough, warm pad of his thumb had brushed along her jaw and tilted her face up toward his, she had forgotten for one whole golden hour that the world had ever taught her to expect less. Then the mask had slipped. The two colored eyes had found hers, one winter blue and one ember gold, and the warmth had cracked straight down the middle into terror. She had run from the best thing that had ever happened to her. Because she had been told every single day of her life in 100 grinding ways that good things were simply not meant for creatures like her. The wind on the ridge bit the memory clean out of her. They had reached the edge. Garrick stopped. Below them the hollow spread out under the failing light, a wide sea of gray and rot and drifting fog, a valley that swallowed the last of the sun whole and gave nothing back. The smell of it rose up the cliff face, thick and wet and wrong. And down in that murk, far below, something was already shifting through the trees. Marin stood at the very edge and did not let her knees betray her. Garrick looked at her then, for the first time, fully. And in his hard, scarred face, something moved that she had not expected to find there. "You really will not say his name," he said. It was not a question. It came out almost like wonder. Maren met his eyes and held them. "No," she said. "Some things are worth more than my life. He is one. The child is another." His hand settled on her shoulder. She felt it tense, felt it gather itself, ready. And then, for one suspended breath, she felt it hesitate, a pause, a half-beat. The narrow space between an order given and a man who has to be the one to carry it out. His fingers loosened by a fraction, his jaw clenched hard enough that she heard the breath hiss between his teeth. And for that one floating moment, she truly believed he might not be able to do it. But the pack was below them, and his whole life was the pack. And whatever had stirred awake in him was not strong enough, not yet, to outweigh the long, cold weight of every year he had spent obeying. "Curl up," he said, low and fast and rough, almost kind, the words tumbling out as though he needed to say them before he lost the nerve. "Take it on your back. Roll. Not the front. Protect the front." And then he pushed. She fell. The world tipped sideways, and she went over the edge. And even as the ground rose up to meet her, she did the thing he had told her, the thing every instinct in her already screamed. She twisted in the air. She wrapped both arms tight around her belly and turned her body so the long slope took her on her shoulders and her spine, so the brambles tore at her back instead of the life she carried in front. She slid. She rolled. Stones hammered her. Branches whipped across her face, and the breath was knocked out of her again and again until the dark spun. And then she came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, broken, gasping, filthy and bleeding and alive. High above her, very far above now, Garrick stood at the edge of the cliff. He did not call down. He did not turn away at once. He simply stood there, a dark, unmoving shape against the dying light, and looked at her for one long moment that she would remember. Then he was gone, and Maren was alone at the bottom of the hollow, with the dark coming down fast. Miles to the south, Kate had stopped running. He stood in a clearing he did not know, head lifted into the wind, every sense he owned straining outward. The pull in his chest had been growing all day, tightening, sharpening, until now it was less an ache than a hand closed hard around his heart. She was close. Closer than she had been in all the long, aching months of the search. He could feel it the way a man feels a storm before he sees the first cloud, in the pressure of the air, in the way the hair rose along his arms, and beneath her thread, that second pulse, faint, quick, stubbornly, impossibly alive. His breath went short. He had not let himself fully believe it until now. He had not let himself say the word, even in the locked silence of his own mind, because to name a hope is to give the world a thing it can take from you. But the wolf in him knew no such caution. The wolf had known since the orchard, since the night a single scent had wrapped itself around him, and simply refused, ever after, to let go. "Mine," it said now, low and certain and shaking with something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, and somehow both at once. Mine and ours. He turned his face toward the high broken country to the north, toward the cold, toward the place the thread was dragging him. And then the thread did something it had never done before. It lurched. A spike of fear, raw and white and not his own, tore straight down the length of the bond and struck him in the chest like a thrown blade. He staggered under the force of it, one hand flying to his sternum. She was afraid. She was somewhere ahead of him, in the dark, and she was terribly, terribly afraid. Cade did not stop to think. Thought had become far too slow for the thing moving in him now. He ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, the black trees smearing past on either side, his heart driving one word into the freezing air with every stride of his legs. Hold on, hold on, hold on. And in the hollow, at the bottom of the ravine, Maren pushed herself up onto trembling arms. Her whole body screamed at her. Her split lip was warm and wet with blood, but her hand, when she dared to open it, still held the small worn knife. And her belly, when she pressed her cold palm against it and waited, answered her after a moment with a faint and stubborn flutter of life. "You are still here," she told the child silently, "and so am I." So we go on. The fog shifted around her, and somewhere out in that gray, much closer now than before, something began to growl. The growl came again, closer, and Maren did the one thing the pack would never have believed of her. She did not freeze. She did not weep into the mud and wait for the end the way they all expected an Omega to wait. Her mind, even battered, even bleeding, did what it had always done best. It went quiet. It went to work. A healer learns fear early and learns to set it down. You cannot save a life with shaking hands. You cannot read a wound while your own heart screams. So somewhere in the long years of mending other people, Maren had taught herself a trick that had nothing to do with the strength of the body. She had taught herself to think when thinking was the last thing the body wanted. So she breathed, slow, through the mouth, not the nose, so the rot of the hollow would not fill her head and choke her thoughts. And she listened past the drumming of her own pulse, the way she had once listened past a fevered child's crying to find the true sound underneath. The growl was to the east, low, searching, not yet certain. It had not found her, not yet. It had caught a thread of something and was pulling at it. Scent. They were tracking her by scent. That, at least, was a problem she knew. She pushed herself up off the cold ground, every muscle protesting, and made her body move before her fear could vote on it. The ravine wall rose at her back. To her left, a tangle of dead roots and fallen stone made a kind of hollow beneath an overturned tree. Not shelter, not really, but a place where the wind would not carry her so far. She crawled to it on hands and knees through the muck, and then she did the work. Her fingers found the things they had spent a lifetime finding. The low gray moss that grew thick on the north side of the rotted trunks, the bruised stems of a bitter weed that any other woman would have stepped over without a glance. She crushed them between her palms, hard until the cold green smell of them bled out sharp and strong, and then she pressed the pulp to her skin, her throat, her wrists, the backs of her knees, all the warm hidden places where a body sings loudest to a hunting nose. It would not hide her completely. Nothing would hide her completely from the things that live down here, but it would muddy the song. It would turn her from a clear, bright note into one more smell among the rot. And in the dark, that might be the difference between found and overlooked. Then she turned her attention to herself. Her lip had split and stopped bleeding on its own. Good. Her left leg had taken the worst of the fall, a deep bruise along the thigh, the skin unbroken. She pressed it with 2 fingers, testing the way she would test a stranger, and the leg answered with pain but held. Not broken, bruised to the bone, but it would carry her. She tore a strip from the inside of her tunic, where the cloth was cleanest, and bound a long, shallow gash on her forearm that she had not even felt until now. And only when the work was done, when the wounds were tended, and the scent was muddied, and there was nothing left for her hands to do, only then did she let herself feel it. She pressed her palm flat to the curve of her belly, waited, and after a long moment, the child answered. A small stubborn flutter against her hand, low and sure, as if to say, still here, I am still here. Something in Marin's chest cracked open, warm and aching, and her eyes stung in the cold. All right, she whispered, so soft the dark almost ate the words. All right, then we keep going. She had been alone before. That was the thing the pack had never understood about her. They thought their cruelty was a wound they had given her. They thought she had been whole and happy until they decided otherwise. But the truth was that Marin had been carving out quiet rooms of dignity in cold places for as long as she could remember. She had learned young that no one was coming to lift her up, that a person could be surrounded by a whole pack and still be the only one in the room who believed she was worth keeping. And she had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would keep herself. That was the rebellion no one ever saw. Every time they called her low, she had gone on healing them anyway, not because she owed them, but because the healing was hers. It belonged to her. It was the one thing they could not take and could not touch, no matter how loudly they sneered. You can be told you are nothing every day of your life, and you can decide every day not to believe it. That decision was the smallest and the largest thing she owned. And now, in the dark, with monsters tracking her scent and her child fluttering beneath her hand, she made it again. I am not nothing, she thought. I never was. And this child will never spend a single day learning to feel worthless. It was a vow. And vows, she had found, were warm in a way that fires were not. She got to her feet, and she began, slowly, painfully, to move. Far behind her, the dark country blurred past beneath a running shadow. Cade had not stopped since the bond lurched. His lungs burned. His legs had passed exhaustion miles ago and come out the other side into something colder and more relentless than effort. He ran on the bond now, the way a man lost at sea swims toward a light, not because his body has anything left, but because the alternative is to sink. The fear had not faded. That was what drove him hardest. He could feel her out there still, that thin, bright thread of terror running back to him through the dark, and every flicker of it was a hand reaching into his chest and squeezing. He had failed her once already. He let himself think it, just for a moment, because punishment kept him moving. He had failed her on the morning he woke alone in the orchard, the warmth gone from beside him, only the lingering scent of her on his skin, and a hollow place where she had been. He had told himself, in the long search since, that she had been frightened, that she had run from what he was, not from what they had been. But knowing the reason did not soften the wound. She had looked at him, in the dark beneath those trees, the way no one had looked at him in years. That was the part the king's hardened heart kept circling back to. People looked at Cade in many ways. They looked with fear, mostly, with calculation, with the careful flattery of those who wanted something and the careful distance of those who had learned what he could do. They looked at the crown and the size of him and the old blood in his veins, and they arranged their faces accordingly. She had looked at none of that. In the orchard she had not known who he was. The mask had seen to that. And so she had looked at the man, and not the throne. And her eyes had been clear and warm and unafraid, and her hands had touched him as though he were simply, ordinarily, worth touching. He had not understood, until she vanished, how starved he had been for that. How long it had been since anyone had reached for him without reaching for the power behind him. And then she was gone, and he had spent every day since learning the exact shape of the hole she left. The wolf in him snarled, low and constant, beneath his thoughts. It did not care about feelings. It cared about scent and direction, and the second small pulse it had found threaded beneath the first. It had one word, and it repeated that word with every stride. Closer, closer, closer. And beneath the wolf's certainty, the man let himself feel the thing he had been holding off for months. A child. His child. Hers. Made on a single golden night, and carried, all this time, through a world he now realized must have been far crueler to her than he had ever let himself imagine. She had been afraid to tell him. He understood that now, with a clarity that hurt. A lowly Omega, alone, carrying the air of a king she had fled. What had her days been like, while he sat in his high cold hall and ached and searched, and could not find her? What had she swallowed? What had she endured to keep that secret safe? To keep that child safe, with no one beside her at all? The thought put a new and terrible edge on his running. If anyone has touched her, the wolf and the man agreed, in a single voice gone quiet and lethal, there will be nothing left of them to bury. He crested a ridge and dropped down the far side, and the wind shifted, and on it came the first faint trace of a smell he knew better than his own name. Her. Mixed with rot and cold, and something sharp and green she had crushed against her skin, but unmistakably her, threaded through the dark like a single warm color in a gray world. His heart lurched, and so did something else, lower and worse, because under her scent, woven all through it, was the reek of the things that lived in the hollow, the mind broken, the cast out, the savage, starving wolves who had forgotten they had ever been anything else. They were close to her, closer than he was. Cade threw back his head and ran like the world was ending, because for him, it was about to. Maren smelled them before she saw them. She had been moving for what felt like an hour, picking her slow, careful way along the base of the ravine, when the wind turned and brought it to her. A stench so thick and so wrong that her stomach clenched and her hand flew to her belly on its own. Unwashed bodies. Old blood gone rancid. The sour animal stink of creatures that had stopped being people a long time ago. She went still against the rock, and through a gap in the dead trees ahead, in the last gray light, she saw them. 5. They moved in their two-legged shapes, but there was nothing human left in the way they moved. Hunched, twitching, their bodies marked with wounds they had clearly given themselves, their hair matted into ropes, their eyes too wide and too bright in the gloom, lit with a starving manic shine that made her skin crawl, and at the front of them, taller than the rest, walked the one the others kept glancing toward. Half his face was a ruin of old burn scars, the skin gone smooth and waxen and wrong. He moved with a terrible, lazy confidence, the confidence of a thing that had not feared anything in a very long time. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and lifted his ruined face to the air, and he breathed in long and slow, the way a man breathes in over a hot meal. "Iron Ridge," he said. His voice was a wet rasp, scraped raw, as though he had screamed it ragged years ago and never let it heal. The others went still around him. "Iron Ridge smell," he said again, and a thin smile pulled at the unburned half of his mouth, but sweeter, softer. He turned his head slowly, and his two bright eyes searched the dark, sliding past her hiding place, and then drifting back, and carrying something small and tender. Maren did not breathe. The crushed weed on her skin was working. She could see it working. His gaze passed over her hollow beneath the fallen tree and snagged and frowned and could not quite fix on her. He smelled her, but the rot and the bitter green had muddied the song just enough that he could not find the note. Not yet. Vance. One of the others rasped the name, low and eager, and the burned wolf lifted a hand without looking, and the other fell silent at once. So that was the name of the thing hunting her. Vance moved deeper into the clearing, his head swinging slowly side to side, sampling the air in long, greedy pulls. His pack fanned out behind him, spreading through the dead trees, and Maren understood with a cold lurch that they were not lost. They were not wandering. They were hunting with method, and they had her scent in their throats, and they would not let it go. She had to move, but moving meant noise, and noise meant the end. She pressed back into the stone until the rough bark of the dead trunk bit through her tunic into her spine, and she held herself still and folded down behind the rock the way she had learned to do in 100 cold corners, except that now it was not shame doing it. Now it was strategy. Now it was a healer's cold, clear calculation of angles and distances and the exact moment a gap might open between two hunting bodies. Her hand closed around the small worn knife in her sleeve. It was a kitchen blade. It would do almost nothing against even one of these. She knew that. She was not fool enough to think otherwise. But she also knew that a creature lunging for your throat does not expect the soft prey to lunge back. And she knew where a body is weak, even when it has forgotten it is a body at all. The eyes, the soft place beneath the jaw. The old wisdom of the healer turned for once the other way around. If it came to it, she would not die curled in the mud. She would die teaching them that even the gentlest thing has teeth. But not yet. Not while there was breath in her and a flutter beneath her hand. Not while there was still a single thread of a chance. So she waited. And Vance moved closer and closer, sniffing, frowning, his ruined face turning slowly toward the fallen tree where a healer crouched in the dark with a bread knife and a vow and a child she would not surrender. He stopped a few paces away. He breathed in, and this time his eyes fixed on her hollow and did not slide away. The thin smile spread across the unburned half of his face. "There you are," Vance rasped softly. Little bird, far up the dark valley, a black shape tore over the ridgeline at a dead run, and the wind carried down to it. All at once, The sudden bright spike of a terror it knew better than any sound in the world. Cade's heart stopped. Then it began to beat again. Hard, like a war drum. And the Alpha King poured everything he had left into the dark. No longer a man running. Barely even a wolf now. Just a single unbearable need wearing fur and fury, hurling itself down toward the hollow with one promise burning in its chest. Not her. Not them. Not while he still drew breath. Hold on, he begged her down the bond, though she could not hear him, though she did not even know he was coming. Hold on, I am almost there. There you are, Vance rasped again. Little bird. And Marin moved first. That was the thing none of them expected. The prey was supposed to freeze. The prey was supposed to scream and scramble and make it easy. So when she came up out of the hollow in a low, hard lunge, instead of cowering back into it, the burned wolf actually flinched. It bought her half a heartbeat. She made it count. Her free hand had not been idle in the dark. While she waited, while she calculated, she had crushed a fistful of the things her healer's fingers knew by feel alone. The pale berries that grew fat and innocent on the low bushes of cold country. The kind a careful woman never let near her cookpot. The kind that stopped a heart if you were foolish, and blinded an eye if you were quick. She threw the pulp straight into Vance's ruined face. He screamed. It was a horrible sound, raw and disbelieving, and his clawed hands flew to his eyes as the burning juice found them. He staggered back, clawing at his own face, and for one wild moment the whole clearing froze in shock around him. Marin did not waste the moment on satisfaction. She was already turning, already driving the small worn knife up and under the jaw of the second rogue, the one who had lunged in to take Vance's place. The blade was a kitchen thing. It was dull and short and made for bread. But a healer knows exactly where the soft places hide, even on a body that has forgotten it is a body, and she put every ounce of her weight behind it. The rogue went down gurgling. 3 left, and Vance, blinded but not dead, howling his fury into the dark. Marin ran. She ran on a bruised leg through a forest that wanted her dead, one arm wrapped hard around her belly, her breath tearing in and out, branches whipping her face. Behind her, the pursuit broke into a chorus of snarls. She did not look back. Looking back was for people who had given up, and she had not given up since she was a child too young to know better. But the hollow had no mercy in it. The ravine wall rose sheer on her right. A tangle of deadfall blocked the way ahead, and the rogues, even half mad, even one of them blinded, were faster than a battered pregnant woman could ever be. They cut her off. She skidded to a halt as a shape dropped from the rocks in front of her, and another closed from the left, and she spun, and there was nowhere left to run. Her back hit the cold stone of the ravine wall, and they came for her. She raised the little knife. She bared her teeth. She would not die curled and weeping. She had decided that already, somewhere back in the mud, and she held to it now with the last of her strength. But 3 against 1, and her arms shaking, and the child heavy in front of her. The first claws caught her shoulder and tore, pain white and bright. She cried out. The knife slipped in her grip, and as the nearest rogue reared up over her, jaws gaping, breath like a grave, Marin did the only thing left in the whole world to do. She wrapped both arms around her unborn child. She turned her face away, and from somewhere far beneath terror, far beneath thought, far beneath even the long, stubborn vow she had carried all her life, something answered. It began in her chest. No, lower. It began in the very center of her, in the warm, hidden place where the child slept. And it was not warmth, and it was not pain. It was both, and it was neither. It was a pressure, building, swelling, ancient beyond anything she had a word for, rising up through her like a tide that had been waiting 1,000 years for the moon to pull it loose. A voice moved through her. Not her own. It was old. It was vast. It carried the weight of countless women who had stood where she stood and refused, every one of them, to be the last. The blood of the first mothers will not be spilled by scavengers, it said. Not tonight. Not this child. Rise. And Marin rose. Light tore out of her. Silver. Blinding. Pure as the cold heart of the moon itself. It poured from her skin in a flood, and the filth and the blood and the bruises of the hollow simply burned away in it, peeling off her like old shadow. The wind came from nowhere and everywhere at once, screaming up around her in a column, lifting her hair, lifting her feet from the muddy ground, and the air went sharp and clean with the smell of cold stone after lightning. The rogue reaching for her was thrown backward as if struck by a falling tree. He hit the ravine wall and crumpled, ribs caved, and did not move again. And the thing that surprised Marin most was that she was not afraid of it. She had spent her life being swept along by the will of others, carried, thrown, sentenced, pressed flat by forces she could not fight. And some part of her had braced, even now, for the light to be one more thing that happened to her, one more current to drown in. But it was not. It was hers. She felt it the way she felt her own 2 hands. And as the remaining rogues fell back screaming, clawing at their eyes against the holy burn of it, Marin did not simply let the power pour out wild and blind. She shaped it. She lifted one trembling hand, and the light bent to follow it. And she understood, in a rush that felt less like learning and more like remembering, that this had always been waiting inside her, beneath the borrowed name, beneath the cracked hands and the cold servant's room. Beneath every single day, someone had called her low. This had been there all along, and no one had ever been able to take it, because no one had ever even known it was there to take. You will not, Marin said. Her voice came out layered, ringing, more than one woman speaking through one throat. You will not have this child. The light surged at her word, and the 2 rogues, still standing, turned and fled into the dark, shrieking, stumbling over each other in their terror to be away from her. And that was the moment the tree line exploded. Kay did not arrive like a man. He came through the dead forest like a catastrophe, like something the night itself had birthed in fury. The trees did not slow him. He went through them, around them, over them, a vast pitch-black shape, larger than any wolf had a right to be, his eyes 2 burning coins in the dark, one winter blue, one ember gold. He had felt the bond go silent. That was what had nearly killed him on the ridge. Not the spike of her terror, but the awful instant after it, when the terror cut out and something else flooded the bond in its place, something so enormous and so strange that for one black moment he had been certain she was gone. He had run into the clearing, braced to find a body. He found a goddess instead. The Alpha King skidded to a halt on the rotted ground, his great chest heaving, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he froze. There, where his broken, bleeding mate should have been, stood a column of living silver light. The wind tore around her in a sacred storm. Her feet did not touch the earth. Her skin poured moonlight, and her face was turned up to the dark sky. And the sheer, crushing weight of the power coming off her pressed down on the whole clearing, like the hand of something far older than kings. The last living rogue, the burned one, blind and howling, came stumbling out of the dark between them. Cade did not even slow. His jaws closed and the matter was finished, swift and total, and the body fell. And then there was nothing left in the hollow that wished her harm. Nothing but him. And he could not move. He who had never knelt to anything. He who had broken alphas with a look and ruled a hard country with a harder hand. He stood in the silver storm of her and felt something he had no name for, because it was awe, and it was hunger, and it was a grief at all the lost months, and it was, underneath all of it, a love so total it frightened him. She had been an omega, the lowest caste, the kind the world threw away, and here she stood, lit like the moon, terrible and radiant, and entirely beyond anything that miserable little pack had ever been fit to look upon. Of course, the wolf thought, with something close to reverence. Of course, it was always you. The light began, slowly, to recede. The wind eased. Her feet drifted down toward the ground. The blinding silver pulled back into her skin like a tide going out, and the woman beneath it was revealed again, and even fading, even exhausted, she had an untouchable grace to her, now that the mud could never reach. She turned her head. Her eyes were still glowing, two pale lamps in the dark, and they found the great black wolf standing motionless across the clearing. For a moment, she did not understand what she was seeing, and then she did. It was not the size of him. It was not the dark fur or the terrible jaws. It was the eyes, one winter blue, one ember gold, the same eyes that had found hers in an orchard under a low gold moon, the night the whole world had narrowed to a single point of warmth at the small of her back. The terror drained out of her face. Something else came into it. Something that had been buried so deep and so long that she had nearly forgotten it was there. A hope she had not let herself hold. "Cade," she whispered, and the light went out. Her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and the last of the ancient power left her all at once, leaving behind only a woman at the very end of her strength, falling. She never hit the ground. Cade was there before she could. The shift took him between one heartbeat and the next, fur to skin, beast to man, and he caught her up against his chest with arms that shook for the first time in his adult life. She was so light. That was the thought that gutted him. She was so light and so cold and so battered. And his. He pulled her in against him, his bare skin against the chill of hers, and he wrapped himself around her as though he could pour his own warmth straight into her body by will alone. Her scent rose up to meet him. Even buried under blood and crushed weed in the rot of the hollow, it was there. It was the scent that had haunted him through every empty month, the one he had chased in his sleep, and to breathe it in again with her actually in his arms undid something in him that had been wound tight for far too long. His throat closed. "I have you," he said, low and rough against her hair. "I have you. You are not alone. Not anymore. Never again." She stirred against him, barely conscious, her brow creasing as though even now, even here, some part of her was braced to be put down, to be let go, to be told this warmth was a mistake. Cade felt that flinch go through her, and it broke his heart cleanly in two. He gathered her closer. "No," he murmured. "No, none of that. Whatever they taught you, it ends here. In my arms you will never have to apologize for taking up room again." His hand moved, slow and trembling, down from her shoulder, across the curve of her side, and came to rest, at last, gently against the swell of her belly. He held his breath, and then he felt it. A flutter, small, stubborn, a faint and certain kick against the palm of his hand. The heartbeat of a life he had not known existed until this very night. A life made on a single golden hour and carried through hell by the bravest creature he had ever stood beside. The Alpha King of the cold north, the breaker of alphas, the terror of the high country, bowed his head over his unconscious mate and wept. It was not a thing he would have let any living soul witness, but there was no one left to witness it. Only the dead trees and the drifting fog and the fading echo of silver light and the woman in his arms and the small, fierce flutter beneath his hand that said, against every cruelty the world had thrown at it, "Still here, both of you," he breathed. "I will guard both of you with everything I am. I swear it, on my blood, on my crown, on the moon that woke in you tonight." Her head turned, the smallest movement, finding the warm hollow of his throat. Even unconscious, even drained to nothing, her body leaned in toward the warmth of him before her mind could weigh the cost, the way it had in the orchard, before either of them knew the price. Cade closed his eyes and pressed his lips to her cold brow and let himself hold her. Just for a moment, just to feel that she was real. Around them, the hollow had gone silent. The hunting things had fled or fallen. The fog curled close, but it did not dare come closer, as though even this cursed valley understood that something had changed in it tonight, that a power thought, lost to the world 1,000 years gone, had opened its eyes again. In the body of a woman, a whole pack had thrown away like refuse. Cade rose to his feet, with her cradled against his chest. He looked down at her face, at the bruises and the split lip and the lashes lying dark against her pale cheek, at the untouchable grace that clung to her even now, in sleep, even after everything. And a cold, clear fury settled over the love, the way frost settles over still water. Someone had done this to her. Someone had stood in a courtyard and called her low. Someone had dragged her up a mountain. Someone had put a hand between her shoulders and pushed her over a cliff to be torn apart, her and the child both, and had walked away to warm fires and full bellies and an easy sleep. Cade's jaw tightened until it ached. "Rest," he said softly to the woman in his arms. "Rest now. The running is over." He turned his face toward the high country, toward the cold pack that had cast her out, and his two colored eyes caught the last of the silver light and held it like a promise. And then he said to no one, to the dark, to the night itself, "We will go and have a reckoning." He stepped over the fallen, wrapped her tight against the chill, and carried her up out of the hollow. Behind them, The fog closed over the place where a queen had woken, and ahead, far ahead, the fires of those who had wronged her burned on into the night, still warm, still easy, still certain they had won. They had no idea what was already coming for them. When Marin woke, the world was warm. That was the first wrong thing. She had spent so long cold that warmth itself felt like a trick now, a thing to be braced against rather than trusted. So she came up out of sleep already flinching, already reaching to shield her belly, already certain the softness around her would be ripped away the instant she let herself believe in it. But it was not ripped away. She lay in a bed wider than the whole servants' room she had once been given to call her own. The sheets were fine and cool and smooth against her skin, woven from something far better than anything she had ever been allowed to touch. Somewhere close, a low fire breathed in a hearth. The air smelled of cedar smoke and crushed healing herbs and clean linen, and there was no rot in it, no mud, no fear. Her wounds had been tended, properly, by careful hands that clearly knew their craft. She lay very still and tried to make sense of it, the way she would try to make sense of any strange new thing, slowly, from the edges in. "You are awake." The voice came from beside the bed, low, rough, worn thin, as though it had spent a long night with nothing to do but wait. Marin turned her head. Cade sat in a heavy chair pulled close to the bedside, his elbows braced on his knees, watching her with those two colored eyes, as though she might dissolve if he so much as blinked. He looked nothing like the terror that had torn the hollow apart. He looked exhausted. He looked, in the firelight, almost young. And he looked, she realized, with a strange lurch, low in her chest, afraid. The most powerful wolf in all the cold country was sitting there, afraid that she would vanish on him again. "My king," she said, and her oldest instinct moved her body before her mind could catch it. Her gaze dropped, her chin lowered. Her whole self began, automatically, to fold into the obedient shape a lifetime had pressed into her. He was off the chair and on the edge of the bed in an instant. His hand found her chin, gently, so gently that it stopped her breath. He tilted her face back up to his, and there was a fierceness in him now that had nothing to do with rage. "No," he said, "never that. You will not lower your eyes to me. Not now. Not ever. Do you understand?" Marin's throat closed. "I am an Omega," she whispered. The old shame rose on its own, the way a bruise rises to the surface of the skin. "It is the only thing I have ever been allowed to be. I do not know how to be anything else. You are the woman who walked into the hollow carrying my child and walked back out of it a queen," Cade said. "You are the bravest creature I have ever stood beside in my life. And in this house, you will never bow your head again." Her eyes filled. She blinked the tears back, hard, because crying was a thing she had taught herself to do, only in private, only in the dark, only where no one could use it against her. But one escaped anyway. It slid down her cheek, and he caught it with the rough, warm pad of his thumb, and he did not look away from it, and he did not rush past it the way most people rushed past a woman's tears. He simply let it be a real thing that mattered. And somehow, that small, unhurried tenderness was harder to bear than all the cruelty of her old pack put together. Then his face changed. The softness did not leave it, but something colder moved in underneath, and his jaw set. and she watched the king come back into him like a tide coming up a beach. They threw you off a cliff, he said quietly, to be torn apart, you and the child you carried. It was not a question. She said nothing. I have already given the order. His voice was flat now, even, the voice of a man describing the weather. My commander rides for the high country at first light. Every wolf who stood in that courtyard, every mouth that jeered at you in the mud, the one who passed the sentence, and the one who put his hand between your shoulders and pushed, and all the rest who stood and watched and did nothing at all. He looked at her. I will leave that pack a black hole in the snow, and I will sleep soundly for the first time in a long while. He said it as though it would comfort her, and Maren lay still in the fine warm bed and felt something turn over slowly in her chest that was not gratitude. She knew that feeling. She knew it intimately. She had carried it up that mountain in her own 2 hands. She had knelt in that freezing mud and dreamed of it, in the lowest and most honest corner of her heart. The day they would pay, the fear in their faces, the sweet, terrible justice of watching the ones who called her low finally learn, in their bones, what it was to be the helpless one in the circle. She wanted it. That was the thing she refused to lie to herself about. Even now, she wanted it badly. The wanting was real, and it was hot, and it did not care that it was ugly. And that was exactly why she could not let it happen. No, Maren said. Cade blinked. No? She pushed herself up against the pillows, slow, her bruised body protesting every inch, and she made herself meet those startled, mismatched eyes and hold them. Not the whole pack. Maren, listen to me. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. Please, because I have thought about almost nothing else, lying here in the warm while you sat there in the dark. There were perhaps a dozen of them who truly chose this, who wanted it, who would do it again tomorrow and feel nothing. Holt, the ones who held the power and enjoyed the holding, the ones who used their fists because they liked the sound. Her hands tightened in the fine sheets. Those I will not weep for. Justice is not the same thing as cruelty. And I promise you, I am not made entirely of forgiveness. Then I do not see the difficulty. The rest of them were afraid. She let that sit in the warm air between them. The girl in the kitchen who threw the word because the alpha was watching, and silence would have cost her too. The boy who jeered because his father jeered, and he had never once been shown another way. The mother who looked away from me because she had her own pups to keep alive, and a woman in the mud is a dangerous thing to be seen pitying. Maren shook her head slowly. They failed me. I know that. Some part of me will never quite forgive the looking away, and I will not pretend otherwise. But fear is not the same crime as cruelty, Cade. And if you burn them all for it, if you make no difference at all between the hand that pushed and the eyes that only flinched, then you become the very thing that threw me off that cliff. He went very still. They looked at me and saw a thing, she went on, softer now, the fire painting her face. That was the whole of their sickness, not hatred even, just that. A person reduced to an object, useful and then disposable, like a worn-out boot. If I take your crown and your wolves, and I answer that by deciding in a fury who lives and who dies, then I have learned nothing at all from any of it. Then I am only a different kind of Holt, with softer hands and a prettier name." The fire breathed in the silence. Cade looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war moving behind his eyes. The wolf in him wanted blood, simple and total. She understood the wolf. Part of her ran with it, but the man was listening, and the man, she was beginning to understand, was a far better thing than the cold, hard country had ever permitted him to be. "You would have me spare the ones who watched you fall," he said slowly, "and let them simply go on living." "I would have you punish the guilty," Marin said, "the truly guilty, the ones who chose, and I would have you leave the rest alive to live with exactly what they did." She held his gaze without flinching. "Think on it. They threw a woman away like refuse, and that woman comes back wearing a crown, with a king's wolves at her back, holding every one of their lives in her open hand, and chooses to close her hand and walk away. That is a heavier thing to carry than death for some. To owe your whole life to the person you spat upon. Let them carry that the rest of their days. Let that be the lesson." A long, slow breath left him, and something in his face shifted, some old iron loosening, as though no one in a very long time had stood before him and asked for mercy and meant it as a strength instead of a weakness to be exploited. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. "No." A ghost of something almost like humor touched the corner of her mouth. "People do keep telling me that." He reached out and took her hand in both of his. He turned it over, slow, and studied it in the firelight. The cracked knuckles, the old white scars, the hard calluses of a lifetime of work no one had ever once thought to thank her for. Then he bent his head and pressed his lips to the very center of her palm, slow and reverent, the way a man kisses a thing he has decided is holy. She felt that warmth travel all the way up her arm and settle, dangerous and sweet, somewhere deep behind her ribs. "Then it will be as you say," he murmured against her skin. "The guilty and no others. You have my word on it, on my blood." It should have ended there. A small, hard peace, one in a warm room between two people learning the shape of each other. But peace in that high keep was a thin and borrowed thing, and Marin would learn that soon enough. The court of the cold north was a beautiful place, full of beautiful knives. She felt it the moment she was strong enough to walk its long stone halls. The bows were deep, and the smiles were wide, and beneath every single one of them ran a cold current of calculation she recognized at once, because she had learned, in a far harder school than this one, that cruelty wears the very same face, whether it dresses itself in rags or in silk. They had heard, of course. They had heard everything. The king had come back out of the wild carrying an omega, a servant, a nobody from some far poor pack at the edge of the world, swollen with a child got in a neutral wood out of any marriage. And now he meant to set her at his side and name her queen over all of them. The whispers trailed her down the corridors like a cold draft under a door. And at the center of all of them stood a woman named Celeste. Marin saw her first from across the great hall and understood the danger of her before a single word had passed between them. Celeste was everything Marin was not. Highborn, polished to a mirror shine, beautiful in the cold, deliberate way of a blade laid out on velvet, raised every day of her life to stand in exactly the place where Marin now stood. That was the part Marin understood, watching her from across the room. Celeste did not look at her with simple hatred. It would have been easier, almost, if she had. She looked at her with something closer to disbelief. The wide-wounded stare of a woman watching the only future she had ever been allowed to imagine handed, without ceremony, to a barefoot stranger from the mud. Later, in a corridor of cold gray stone, Celeste found her alone. "You think you have won something," Celeste said. Her voice was lovely and brittle, like thin ice stretched over deep black water. "You think all of this is a gift." Marin said nothing. She had learned long ago the strange power of saying nothing. "They taught me to walk before they taught me to speak," Celeste went on. And for just a moment the Polish cracked, and underneath it something raw and frightened and very young showed through. How to hold a room, how to wear a crown without bending under it, how to be a queen. It was the whole of me. There was nothing else they ever let me become. Her chin lifted, trembling. And then a girl walks out of the trees with no name and no blood and bare dirty feet, and they hand her my entire life and call it fate. So no, I do not think this is a gift. I think it is a theft, and I think you should be afraid. And Marin, to her own quiet surprise, felt something that was not hatred. She felt the cold, clean recognition of one woman looking at another, and seeing, even in the worst of her, the shape of the very same wound. Celeste had been hemmed in too, in her own gilded way, made into a single purpose, a thing built for a role and valued only for the place she might one day be allowed to fill. A different cage entirely, but the same iron bars. It did not make her safe. Marin could see plainly that it did not. A creature that believes it has already lost everything is the most dangerous creature in any room. But it made her human, and Marin had decided, lying in that warm bed with her hand on her child, that she would not forget the humanity of even the ones who came to harm her. Not because they had earned it, because the moment she forgot, it would be the first step toward becoming them. "I did not take your life," Marin said quietly. "Someone handed you a very narrow one long ago and told you it was the only one you were permitted to want. That was a cruelty. But it was a cruelty done to you, Celeste, not by me." She held the other woman's eyes, steady and unafraid. "You are so much more than a place at a king's side. I am sorry that no one in all your fine education ever once thought to tell you so." For a single instant, something flickered across Celeste's polished face. Confusion, something almost like grief. And then it closed, hard and bright as a shutter, and the brittle smile returned, and whatever had nearly opened sealed itself shut. "Save your pity," Celeste said softly. "You are going to need every scrap of it for yourself." She swept away down the corridor, her skirts hissing across the stone, and Marin stood alone in the cold draft and watched her go, and felt, for the first time, the true chill of what was coming. Because behind Celeste stood her father, Lord Thorn, the head of the council, and the most patient knife in that whole hall of knives. Men like Thorn did not rage. They did not make threats in corridors. They smiled, and they waited, and they arranged matters quietly, from a distance, so that the dangerous thing simply ceased to exist, with no blood ever found anywhere near their own clean hands. The summons came that same evening. The council would convene. The king's chosen would be presented before them, her claim examined, her worth weighed and judged before all the assembled lords and ladies of the cold north. Cade was furious. He wanted to refuse it outright, to set her on the throne and dare any one of them to so much as breathe an objection. But Maren stopped him once again. "No," she said, "I will stand before them. I want to. You owe them nothing. I am not doing it for them." She turned to the tall, dark window and looked out over the moonlit snow, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. "I am doing it for myself. I ran once in an orchard because I truly believed a creature like me was not allowed good things. I have done enough running for one life." Her reflection in the cold glass was perfectly calm. "Let them look at me. Let them judge me to my face. I will not give them my tears, and I will not give them my fear. I will give them only the truth, standing up straight in my own voice. And then we shall all see who is truly fit to rule here." Cade came to stand behind her. He did not touch her. He only looked at her reflection beside his own in the dark window glass, the king and the woman from the mud, and something in his hard face moved close to wonder. "They will try to break you in that hall," he said quietly. "They will try," Maren agreed. And far below them, in a locked and private room, lit by a single candle, a careful hand was already pouring something pale and sweet and patient and deadly into an ornate silver cup, preparing, without the slightest hurry, the trap that was meant to end everything. The great hall had been built to make small things feel smaller. Maren understood that the moment she stepped into it. The ceiling soared up into shadow. The pillars rose like the trunks of frozen trees. Cold light fell through tall windows of colored glass, and the floor was a vast field of polished stone that a person had to cross alone, watched while the whole court looked down from the sides and judged the length of every step. She crossed it anyway, slowly, her chin level, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, not to hide it, but to claim it. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, and her hair had been brushed until it caught the light, and she knew exactly what they saw when they looked at her. They saw the caste she had been born into. They saw the mud they imagined still clung to her. They did not see the woman who had walked out of the hollow alive. They never did. People like this. They only ever saw the label. Let them, she thought. They will learn. Cade stood by the throne, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes followed her across the floor as though he wanted to cross it and carry her the rest of the way. She caught his gaze once and held it, just for a breath, and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not yet. Let me do this standing." The lords and ladies watched in a silence thick enough to cut. And then Lord Thorn stepped forward, and the silence broke. "Your Majesty," he said, and his bow was a small masterpiece of disrespect, deep enough to be correct and shallow enough to be a wound. "We rejoice, of course, at your safe return, and we welcome the chance to meet your guest." The pause before the word was a knife all on its own. "She is not my guest," Cade said. His voice was very low. "She is your queen, and she carries my heir." A murmur rolled through the hall, soft and ugly. "Ah," said Thorn, smiling. "Yes, the heir. There is the difficulty, you see. He turned, addressing the assembled court now, the way a man addresses a jury he has already bought. An heir is a sacred thing. A bloodline is a sacred thing. The law of this house has held for longer than any of us has drawn breath, that the one who stands at the king's side must be of proven blood. And here we are asked to set above us all an Omega, a servant, a woman got with child in a neutral wood, by no one she will name. He spread his hands, the picture of reluctant duty. How can any of us know this child is what the king believes it to be? How can we hand the future of the cold north to a story and a stranger? You question my honor, Cade said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I protect the realm, sire, Thorn replied smoothly, as is my duty. There are whispers, you understand, of a trick of the light in the wild. Marsh gas, the fevered dreams of a frightened woman. We cannot crown a queen on a tale told in the dark. And that was when Celeste stepped out from behind her father. She held a chalice. It was a beautiful thing. Old silver, worked all over with leaping wolves and twisting vines, and it caught the cold window light and threw it back in pale flashes. She held it before her in both hands, the way one holds a thing of great reverence, and she smiled at Marin, and the smile was a lovely, terrible thing. There is a way to end all doubt, my king, Celeste said. Her voice rang out clear and sweet, pitched to carry to every corner of the hall. An old way, the right of truth. A stir went through the court, old hungers waking. Let her drink from the chalice of the first mothers. Celeste lifted the cup a fraction. If she truly carries blessed blood, if the child is truly royal, the sacred waters will know her and do her no harm. But if she is a liar, if she is a fraud who has wormed her way into a king's bed to pollute his line, then the waters will reject her, and we will all see the truth with our own eyes. She turned, slow, letting the whole hall feel the weight of it. Surely a true queen would not fear a cup of clean water. Cade was moving before she finished. He stepped down off the dais and put himself between Celeste and Marin, and his face had gone to that flat, lethal stillness that Marin was learning to read. I will not have my mate subjected to your old games, he said. The child's scent is mine. That is the only proof any of you will ever require. The matter is closed. And if she refuses... Celeste turned to the murmuring court, her voice rising. Then she tells us herself what she is, a fraud, an Omega sent to spoil the royal blood. If she is innocent, why would she fear to prove it? The murmur swelled into something dangerous. Marin watched it spread across their faces, the doubt, the appetite, the old eagerness of a crowd that has been promised a spectacle. She felt the whole fragile thing tipping. She could see, plain as day, the trap that had been laid. Refuse, and she was a liar, and Cade's claim crumbled and his enemies won. Drink, and... She stepped forward. I will drink it, Marin said. The hall went utterly silent. Cade turned to her, and the look on his face was pure anguish. Marin, no, it is all right. She laid a hand on his arm. She felt the rigid tension in it, the leashed violence, the fear he would never show these people but could not hide from her. Trust me, she said very softly, for him alone. I know exactly what I am doing. His eyes searched hers. And whatever he found there, it was enough. He stepped aside, but his hand dropped to the pommel of his sword, and his knuckles went white. And she knew he was one breath away from painting the whole hall red if anything went wrong. Celeste approached, the chalice held out before her, triumph glittering in her eyes like frost. And as Marin reached for the cup, as her fingers closed around the cold-worked silver of it, a scent rose to meet her, beneath the clean smell of the water, beneath the cold metal tang. Something sweet, sharp, faintly bitter underneath the sweetness, the way the very worst things in the green world hide themselves behind a pleasant face. Marin knew it at once. She had spent her whole life learning the names of things that healed and things that killed, often the very same plants, divided only by the careful hand that prepared them. And this she would have known blindfolded in the dark. Monkshood, wolfsbane, the pale tall flower that any healer treats with terror, refined here to something concentrated and patient, and utterly without mercy. It was a killing dose, easily. A dose meant to seize the heart and stop the breath, and, before it did, to tear the child from her womb. There was no sacred water in this cup. There was only murder, dressed in old silver, and a lovely smile. Marin lifted her eyes to Celeste's face, and Celeste, certain no one else could read it, let the smile widen by a fraction. A silent confirmation, a private gloating, woman to woman, over the killing she was about to do in front of the whole court and call a miracle. Something cold and clear settled over Marin then, and deeper than the cold, lower than thought. She felt it. The power, stirring at her fingertips where they touched the silver, uncoiling slow and certain along her arm, awake now and listening. No longer the wild thing that had erupted in the hollow, but something that knew her and waited on her word. It would not let the child fall. She understood that the way she understood her own pulse. The ancient voice stirred in her, low and certain, the one that had spoken in the dark valley. Let them see, it murmured. Let them all see what they have tried to throw away. And deep beneath that, in her own voice, in the stubborn, quiet voice that had kept her alive through every cold year, Marin made her choice, not from weakness, not as a victim taking what was given, as a woman who had decided, long ago, that she would meet the worst of the world standing up. She would turn their trap into a stage. To the first mothers, Marin said clearly, lifting the chalice so the whole hall could see. And she drank it down. She drank deep, all of it. She did not flinch from the bitterness, and she did not hesitate. And a gasp went through the court at the sheer, steady boldness of it. Celeste took a small step back, her lips parting, waiting for the Omega to clutch her throat and fall. Thorn's mouth curved. He half turned, ready to summon the guards to drag away the body of a poor dead fraud. And for one terrible heartbeat, the poison answered. It hit her bloodstream like swallowed fire. Pain bloomed through her chest, sudden and enormous, and her knees went soft, and the chalice slipped in her grip. The hall tilted. Somewhere very far away, she heard Cade roar her name, heard the ring of a sword leaving its sheath, felt the rush of him lunging toward her. But before he could reach her, before the poison could take what it came for, the great hall went black. Every fire in every hearth snuffed out at once, as though a vast cold breath had passed over them. The colored light in the tall windows died. The midday sun was simply gone. swallowed whole, and an impossible night fell over the assembled court of the cold north. Screams erupted in the dark. Lords and ladies who had never known a moment of true fear in their gilded lives clawed at each other, blind, panicking. And then a single shaft of pure light tore down through the high stone ceiling, silver, blinding, the light of a moon that hung in no sky any of them could see. It struck Marin where she stood, dead center, and poured down over her like a falling river. The chalice in her hand went soft. The old worked silver melted, ran like water, dripped harmless and bright onto the polished stone. And the fire in her blood, the patient killing poison, simply burned away, consumed in an instant by something far older and far stronger than any flower that ever grew. Marin lifted her head and rose. Her feet left the floor. Her midnight gown billowed in a wind that came from nowhere. The light poured out of her skin now, not falling on her, but rising from her, and where in the hollow it had been raw and wild and desperate, here it was something else entirely. Here it was sovereign. She had learned its shape. She did not let it pour out blind. She wore it the way a queen wears a crown, and the aura that spread out from her was no longer the frantic blaze of a cornered animal. It was a slow, vast, crushing weight, the pressure of something that had ruled long before any of their houses had names. It pressed down on the hall, and every wolf in it went to their knees, lords who had sneered, ladies who had whispered, alphas who had never bent to anything in their lives folded down onto the cracking marble, gasping, unable to lift their heads against the sheer dominance rolling off her in waves. The stone itself split in long lines beneath the force of her presence. Marin opened her eyes. They were two pools of pure white light. "You dare." Her voice came out layered, ringing, a harmony of countless women speaking through a single throat, the voice of every mother who had ever been called low and refused to stay there. "You dare raise poison against the blood of the first mothers. You dare strike at the child in my womb, in this very hall, and call it law." She let the silver light dim, just enough that her own face showed through it, fierce and unafraid, and when she spoke again, it was in her own plain voice, and somehow that was the more terrible of the two. "Hear what was in that cup, all of you, and hear it from a healer who has known these plants her whole life. That was no sacred water. That was monkshood, refined and patient, a dose meant to stop my heart and tear my child from me before I hit the floor. A trial that cannot be survived by anyone, blessed or not. It was never a test." She turned her white gaze slowly across the kneeling court. "It was a murder, planned in this house, and dressed in old silver to make you all witnesses to it, and call it the will of heaven." Celeste was screaming. She had crawled backward across the stone until she struck a pillar, and now she crouched there, blood weeping from her nose, her lovely face slack with a terror beyond anything Marin's old pack had ever shown her. And then, with the weight of the truth pressing down on her along with the aura, something inside her simply gave way. "He made it," she sobbed. The words tore out of her before she could stop them, raw and ruined. "My father. He mixed it himself, behind a locked door. He told me it would look like the hand of the first mothers. He told me it was the only way to keep what was mine." Her whole body shook. "I carried the cup. I knew. I knew, and I carried it anyway. But the poison was his. Thorn lay flat on the floor, his fine robe spread around him, unable to so much as raise his chin to deny it, and the silence of him was its own confession. Only Cade remained standing. He stood in the silver storm of her, his sword forgotten in his hand, and he was not crushed. He was not driven down with the rest of them. The ancient power knew him, recognized him for what he was, her chosen, her guardian, and instead of crushing him, it seemed to fill him, to straighten his spine, to set a wild, fierce light in his two-colored eyes. He looked at her, and there were tears on the king's hard face, and he did not care who saw them now. "There she is," he breathed, not in fear, in something closer to worship. There she has always been. Maren turned her white eyes upon the court. "Hear me," she said, and the foundations of the keep trembled with it. "I was born into the lowest caste you have. I scrubbed floors. I mended your kind through fevers and through births, and I was paid in scorn. I was thrown into a courtyard of mud and called a thing. I was sentenced to be torn apart, and the child with me, by people who looked at me and saw nothing worth saving." The light pulsed in time with her words. "And here you sit, the great lords of the cold north, and the first thing you do when I come before you is reach for poison." The hall was silent but for weeping, and then a voice spoke from the great doors, rough, uncertain, the voice of a man stepping into a light he had spent his whole life avoiding. "She speaks the truth, all of it." Every head that could turn, turned. A big man stood in the doorway, scarred along one side of his jaw, travel-stained and pale. Maren knew him. Garrick, the hand the pack had used, the one who had pushed her over the edge of the world, and whose grip had hesitated, just once, for half a beat, at the very last. He had come down out of the high country with the rest of them, and somewhere on that long, cold road, he had found something he had been missing his whole life. He came forward into the cracked and silver-lit hall, and he went to one knee, not crushed like the others, but choosing it, his head bowed, his voice shaking. "I served the Alpha Holt," he said. "I stood in that courtyard. I climbed that ridge. I put my own hand between her shoulders, and I pushed her, carrying a child, off a cliff to be eaten, because my Alpha told me to, and I had never once in my life found the nerve to tell him no." His voice broke, "and I have not slept a single night since." He lifted his head, and he looked not at Maren, but at the assembled court, and his ruined, honest face was terrible to see. "You want the truth of the wild? I am the truth of the wild. There was no marsh gas. There was no trick of the light. I stood at the top of that cliff, and I watched a power come off her that turned the whole valley to silver. I have carried that and my shame all the way here to say it out loud once where it matters. She is exactly what she says she is. And the only crime in that courtyard was ours." A sound went through the court, and Celeste, crouched against her pillar, kept weeping. Not the weeping of a caught conspirator now. Something younger and more broken than that. The weeping of a woman who has just watched the only future she was ever taught to want shatter on the stone, and understood, far too late, that she had thrown her whole self into the breaking of it. Maren drifted down from the air. Her bare feet touched the cracked floor, and the wind died, and the silver light drew back slowly into her skin until she stood there only a woman again. A woman in a midnight gown, with her hand on her belly, and an untouchable stillness about her that no one in that hall would ever again mistake for weakness. The fires roared back to life in their hearths. The sun returned to the colored windows, and the whole court of the cold north knelt in the wreckage of their own contempt before the Omega they had tried to throw away, and waited, trembling, to learn what she would do with them. Marin looked down at Thorn, at Celeste, at Garrick on his knees, with his shame held out like an offering, at the rows of bowed and broken lords who had reached for poison rather than reach for grace. Their lives sat in her open hand, every one of them, and the only question left in that vast and silent hall was what kind of queen she had decided to become. She felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, not the weight of the power. That had drawn back into her, quiet now, waiting. This was a different weight, heavier. The weight of a choice that would tell every soul in that room, and every soul who would ever hear the story, exactly what kind of ruler had risen out of the mud. She had wanted blood once. She remembered that. Kneeling in the freezing courtyard, she had dreamed of this exact moment, of the day the powerful would grovel and she would decide their fate. The dream had been sweet, and standing here now, with the dream made real, she understood at last that it had also been a trap. The last trap. The one they had set for her without even meaning to. Because the easiest thing in the world, the thing they would all expect, the thing that would prove she had always been just like them, was to answer their cruelty with cruelty of her own. She would not give them that. She would give them something they had never once given her. She would give them a true reckoning, measured, clear-eyed, the kind that knows the difference between a wicked thing and a frightened one. "Rise," Marin said. Slowly, trembling, the lords and ladies of the cold north pulled themselves up off the broken marble, blood on some of their faces, terror on all of them. They did not dare meet her eyes. They who had looked down on her from the height of their birth now could not lift their gaze from the floor. She let them feel that, for one moment. Just one. Then she turned to the man flat on the stone at the center of it all. "Lord Thorn." He managed to rise to his knees. The patient smile was long gone. What remained was an old man's bare face, and behind the bluster and the silk, there had only ever been this, a small cold hunger for power, dressed up for a lifetime as duty. "Your Majesty," he rasped, "mercy, I beg you. I am an old man. There has been some terrible misunderstanding. The cup. I knew nothing of the cup." "Your own daughter named you a breath ago," Marin said, "and you could not even raise your head to call her a liar. The silence was answer enough." He had nothing. His mouth worked and produced nothing at all. "You poured that poison with your own hands, behind a locked door," she went on, quiet and even, and the very quiet of it made it worse. "You did not act in fear. You were never afraid of me. You looked at me, weighed me, and decided I was an inconvenience to be removed. Coldly, cleverly, over a cup of wine and a clean conscience. You would have killed a woman and the child in her womb in front of this entire court and called it the will of heaven." She stopped before him, That is not a man who looked away from a hard thing. That is a man who looked straight at murder and found it convenient. For that there is no soft word, and I will not pretend to find one." She turned to Cade. He had come down from the dais to stand near her, and there was no question in his eyes, only the cold readiness of a king who would do whatever his queen required. "The law of this house names the murder of the royal line as treason," Marin said so the whole court would hear. "The penalty for treason is not mine to soften, and I will not soften it. Let the law answer him, lawfully, witnessed, not in a rage, in the cold, clear light, the way justice is meant to be done." Cade inclined his head. "It will be done as you say, by the law, before witnesses." His voice was iron. "Not a single stroke more than the law requires." The guards came. Thorn was taken, and he did not go quietly. But he went, and the manner of his ending would be a lawful thing, recorded and just, and not a thing of fury. And that, Marin knew, was its own kind of message to a court that had only ever known power used like a fist. Then she turned to Celeste. The young woman was still crouched against the pillar, blood drying beneath her nose, her lovely gown crushed and ruined around her. She had stopped weeping. She looked up at Marin with the hollow eyes of someone waiting to die, and not much caring anymore whether she did. The hall expected the same sentence, the daughter who had carried the cup. Marin looked at her for a long moment, and she remembered the corridor, the cracked polish, the frightened young thing underneath all that beautiful armor, taught to walk before she could speak, valued for one thing and nothing else. "You carried the cup," Marin said. "You knew what was in it. You will carry that for the rest of your days, and I will not take it from you." Celeste's chin trembled. "Then sentence me. I have nothing left to lose." And Marin knelt. A gasp went through the hall. The queen, the woman wreathed in moonlight a moment ago, lowered herself down to the cracked floor to be level with the broken creature against the pillar. "You wanted me dead," Marin said quietly, "because you believed I had stolen the only life you were ever allowed. I know that wound. I know what it is to be told you are worth one thing only, and to be terrified of who you are without it." Her voice gentled. "I am not going to take your life, Celeste, but I am going to take the cage." The young woman flinched as though she had been struck. "You are stripped of your father's house and his ambitions. You will never sit at the head of anything in this realm. That part of you ends today, the part they built." Marin rose, and her voice carried now to the whole court. "But you are free of it. For the first time in your life, no one has any use for you at all. No throne to win, no role to fill, no purpose chosen before you could speak." Something almost gentle crossed her face. "Go and find out who you are without the cage they raised you in. Some people never get that terrible gift. Do not waste it." She turned away, and behind her, Celeste pressed both hands over her mouth and wept in a way she had never been allowed to weep before. Not the tears of a punished conspirator, the tears of someone set down, at last, from a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was not part of her own body. Marin did not look back. Mercy, she was learning, is not the same as forgetting. It is the harder, cleaner thing. It is looking straight at the worst of someone and choosing not to become it. She turned last to the far wall, where the men of Holt's pack stood gray-faced in chains, brought down from the high country to learn their fate. She did not draw it out. They had drawn out her own suffering long enough, and she would not borrow their habits. Those of you who chose it will answer by the law, the same as Thorn, she said, the fists, the sentence, the men who laughed while I begged for my child. Cruelty that is chosen will always be answered here. A few of them broke where they stood. The rest of you only looked away. You failed me, and I will not pretend you did not. But you will live. You will go home. And every day for the rest of your lives, you will know that the woman you watched fall held your fate in her open hand and chose to close it. Carry that. It is a heavier sentence than any blade, and it is the one I choose to give. It was not what they expected. It was not what any of them expected. They had built their whole world on the certainty that power, once gained, is always used the way they would have used it. She was about to teach the cold north otherwise. Marin walked back to the center of the hall and stood beneath the broken ceiling where the moonlight had poured down and lifted her voice one final time. Hear me, all of you, and carry it home to every pack that answers to this throne. From this day, there is a new law in the cold north. The hall went utterly still. No soul born under my rule will be called low for the caste of their birth. No Omega will scrub the blood from another wolf's boots and be told that is all they are. No child will grow up learning, the way I learned, that good things are not meant for creatures like them. Her voice rang clear and certain. A person's worth is not granted by their rank. It is not given by an alpha, and so it cannot be taken by one. It is theirs. It was always theirs. It is the one thing no crown and no fist has any right to touch. She let it land. I know this is true, because they spent my whole life trying to convince me otherwise, and they never once succeeded. I am standing here, so I know it can be done. A person can be told they are worthless from the cradle and still refuse, every single morning, to believe it. Her hand came to rest on the swell of her belly. I am done letting anyone be taught that lie. Not in my realm. Not anymore. And into the silence that followed, she turned back to Garrick, still on his knee. You, she said, you are the first to live under that law, and you will be its proof. You did a terrible thing because a terrible man told you to, and you had spent your whole life learning to obey terrible men. I will not wave that away. But you are also the only soul who walked into this hall today and chose the truth when a lie would have kept you safe. A frightened man who finally finds his courage is not the same as a cruel one, and I will not pretend he is. Garrick lifted his head, hardly daring. Stand up, Marin said. You will not be put to death. You will be put to work. There are wolves in this realm who still answer fear with fists the way Holt did. You know that sickness from the inside. Go and help me root it out. Spend the rest of your life being the thing you could not be at that cliff. That is your sentence. Live and be brave from now on. He rose, slow, uncertain. And then this huge scarred man who had thrown her to the monsters lowered his head and wept without shame before the entire court because he had ridden all that way expecting death and been handed a reason to live instead. And it was then, into the hush, that a small and hesitant figure appeared in the great doors. Marin turned and her heart caught. Nessa, the girl from the kitchen, the one who had pressed a small worn knife into a dying woman's palm and stepped back into the crowd before she could be caught. She had been found among the pack folk brought down from the north, and now she stood in the doorway, swallowed by the enormous cold of the place, her eyes huge and fixed on Marin as though she could not quite believe what she was seeing. Marin crossed the whole length of that vast hall to reach her. She did not wait for the girl to bow. She took both of Nessa's rough, small hands in her own, the hands of another Omega, another servant, another soul the world had decided was worth nothing. "You gave me a knife," Marin said softly, "when giving me anything at all could have cost you your life. You were the only one in that whole courtyard who saw a person and not a thing." Her voice thickened. "That one small kindness was a light I held on to in the dark. It is part of why I am still alive to stand here." Nessa's lip trembled. I had to. It was not right, what they did." "I know." Marin pressed the girl's hands. "And do you understand what that makes you? In a courtyard full of the powerful, you had the only real courage in the room. Not the alpha, not the enforcer. You, a kitchen girl with nothing to your name and everything to lose." She drew the girl gently into the light, in full view of all the lords and ladies who would never in their lives have spared the child a glance. "You will not go back to scrubbing floors," Marin said. "You will have a place here, an honored one, for as long as you wish it. And every soul in this realm will know your name and what you did, so they understand exactly what courage looks like. It does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it is a frightened girl with a bread knife who decides to be kind anyway." Nessa began to cry, and Marin gathered her in and held her, the way no one had ever held either of them when they were young and cold, and certain they did not matter. And the court of the cold north watched their queen embrace a kitchen servant in the middle of the great hall, and slowly, slowly began to understand what kind of world she meant to build. Later, when the hall had emptied, when the broken marble was being swept and the fires burned low and warm, Cade found her at the tall window, looking out over the moonlit snow. He came to stand beside her. He did not crowd her. He had learned that about her, in their short, strange time together. She had been hemmed in her whole life, by hands and by orders, and by other people's certainty about who she was allowed to be. So he simply stood near, and let her have the quiet, and waited. "You could have killed them all," he said at last. "Most rulers would have. I would have, before you. I rode toward your old pack, ready to leave nothing standing. I know. Why didn't you?" Marin was quiet for a moment, watching the snow. "Because the cruelest thing they ever did to me," she said slowly, "was not the cold, or the courtyard, or even the cliff. It was teaching me to believe I was nothing. That was the wound under all the others, and the only way to truly answer it was to refuse, completely, to do the same to anyone else, even to them." She turned to look at him. "If I had answered their cruelty with cruelty, they would have won. They would have made me into a smaller, harder version of themselves, and called it justice. I would rather be a queen they cannot understand than a tyrant they would recognize." Cade looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something he had never done for any living soul. The Alpha King of the Cold North, the breaker of alphas, lowered himself to one knee before her, not because the law required it, not because her power forced him down. He knelt because he chose to, his head level with hers, his two colored eyes full. "Then I am the most fortunate wolf who ever lived," he said roughly, "to have searched the mud of 100 packs looking for you, and found you in the worst of them, shining the whole time, where no one had the eyes to see it." Marin reached down and touched his face, the same gesture, almost, that had undone her in the orchard, given back to him now in the warmth of a window and the safety of a thing finally won. "Stand up," she said softly. "You taught me not to bow my head. I will not have you bowing yours." He rose, and he drew her in, slow, careful, and she came to him willingly this time, no mask between them and no fear. She rested her head against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart, and breathed in cedar and storm and the deep, clean thing beneath it that she had once been too frightened to keep. His hand found the swell of her belly. The child stirred beneath it, that small, stubborn flutter, and Marin felt his breath catch, the way it caught every single time, as though the wonder of it never wore down. "Both of you," he murmured into her hair. "Safe. Home." "Home," she echoed. And she found, testing the word, that for the first time in her whole life, it did not feel like a thing that belonged to other people. Outside, the snow fell soft over the cold north, over the keep and the packs and the far poor villages where, even now, some other servant knelt in some other cold place and was told that she was nothing. But the word was already going out, carried on every road, whispered hearth to hearth, that the throne had changed. That worth was not granted by rank anymore, and so could not be stripped by it. That a woman they had thrown into the mud to die had walked back out of the dark, not to take her revenge, but to make certain no one else would ever be thrown away again. She had been called the lowest of the low, a servant, a burden, a thing, and she had become a queen, not because of the ancient power that woke in her blood, not because of the crown or the king, or the moonlight that had poured from her skin in that broken hall, but because through all of it, through the courtyard and the cliff and the hollow and the poison, she had held on to the one thing they had tried hardest to take. She had never, not for a single day, let them convince her that any soul was worth less than another, not even hers, and that, far more than any magic, was what made her worthy of the throne. The child kicked once more beneath her hand, strong and sure, as if it already understood the world it was being born into. A kinder one, a world its mother had walked through hell to build.